All right, welcome back to the Health Filter. In this episode, we're talking about how cellulite is more interesting than you think. Cellulite is not simply a body fat problem, and I actually think it's a really interesting example of what happens when we try to explain the body through one tissue or one system. Because when you look at cellulite through an osteopathic lens, you're not just looking at fat. You're looking at skin, connective tissue, superficial fascia, adipose tissue. You're looking at circulation, fluid exchange, hormones, muscles, mechanical forces, all occupying and influencing the same space. So let's try to filter this a little bit differently. I want you to think of what you see on the surface of the body, almost like a landscape. If you saw a valley in a landscape, you wouldn't assume that the grass caused it. You'd understand that what you see at the surface reflects the geology, the water, the pressure, and whatever structures underneath it. And your tissues are obviously far more dynamic than a landscape, but the same idea is useful. What you see on the surface is being shaped by what exists underneath it. And underneath your skin is subcutaneous connective tissue that contains fat cells, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and fibrous connective tissue called septa. Now, those septa help tether the skin towards that deeper tissue. You can imagine them kind of like anchor points that hold a quilt down. Now imagine there's this softer material underneath that quilt. Where the quilt is tethered, it stays pulled down, but between those attachment points, the softer material can push upward. And that interaction between the tethering down and the pushing upward contributes to the dimpling that we recognize as cellulite. And anatomy matters here. The architecture of these connective tissue septa tends to be different in women than in men. In women, their arrangement more readily allows adipose tissue to protrude upward between those connective tissue attachments, which immediately tells us something important. Cellulite isn't simply a measurement of how much fat you have. You can be lean, you can be muscular, you can train super consistently, and you can still have cellulite. It is absolutely not evidence that something has gone wrong. But this is where I think it gets even more interesting. Because these aren't static layers that are stacked on top of each other like sheets of plywood, this is living tissue. Blood, arterial blood has to get there, and venous blood has to be able to leave that space. And fluid is constantly moving between your vascular system and the space around your cells. Your lymphatic system helps return excess interstitial fluid and proteins back towards circulation. And connective tissue is continually adapting to forces that are placed upon it. And all of this is happening within an extracellular matrix that influences how tissues transmit force, tolerate pressure, and move relative to one another. Think of that less like solid scaffolding and more like this living neighborhood. There are roads bringing things in, roots that are carrying things out, and structures that are providing support. Spaces between those structures, and then there's activity that's constantly changing within that environment. If traffic changes on one road, it can affect what's happening elsewhere, but that doesn't mean the road caused the neighborhood to happen. And that's an important distinction when we start talking about cellulite. Could fluid accumulation, circulation, or connective tissue properties influence how cellulite appears? Potentially, but that's very different from saying your lymphatics are clogged, the road is blocked, and that's why you have cellulite. That's where wellness explanations can take a piece of legitimate physiology and stretch it much further than the evidence allows. Dry brushing, for instance, doesn't magically remove cellulite, and neither does releasing your fascia. And cellulite is not evidence that your lymphatic system needs to be detoxed. You might temporarily change fluid distribution or the appearance and feel of tissue, but changing the environment is not the same thing as changing the underlying architecture. And hormones add even another layer. Estrogen influences where women tend to store subcutaneous fat and has an effect on vascular and connective tissue physiology. Genetics influence fat distribution and your connective tissue architecture. Age changes your skin thickness and your collagen. And then there's another layer that I care a lot about, and that's mechanical loading. Muscle sits underneath all of this. When you progressively overload your muscle, you can change the muscle size, strength, and ultimately your body composition. And those adaptations can change the landscape underneath the skin and therefore potentially change how the surface looks. But strength training doesn't reorganize female anatomy into a cellulite-free body. And I think that's an important distinction, because somewhere along the way, we took something that is extraordinarily common in the female anatomy and turned it into another problem women are supposed to solve. And then we built entire industries around individual pieces of the physiology. Lose fat, drain your lymph, release the fascia, increase circulation, balance your hormones, build all the muscle. Each explanation might contain a small piece of relevant physiology. The mistake is assuming that one piece explains the whole. And that's where my osteopathic lens is different. I'm less interested in finding the single tissue that's supposedly responsible. I'm interested in relationships, structure, pressure, fluid exchange and circulation, connective tissue and muscle, the hormonal environment, absolutely movement and load, because biology rarely gives us one isolated lever controlling isolated outcome. So here's the takeaway that I want you to remember. Cellulite is an appearance and not a diagnosis. Its appearance emerges from the interaction of normal anatomy, connective tissue, adipose tissue, genetics, hormones, fluid dynamics, skin, and the structures underneath it. Some of those things are for sure adaptable. Some are transient, and some are simply part of your anatomy. And understanding that distinction matters, because the goal of understanding your physiology shouldn't be to give you more things to fix. It should be to help you recognize what actually needs changing and what does not. And maybe cellulite is a particularly good reminder of that. Sometimes what we see at the surface isn't a problem that's asking to be solved. It's simply the visible expression of a much more interesting system underneath. And this is the health filter. This is where we take the health claims that you hear every day and put the physiology back into it. Love to hear your thoughts and follow for more.